We live in an age where noise feels endless, where silence is often mistaken for emptiness, or worse, weakness. From the constant tapping of keyboards to the unending scroll of social media feeds, from the chatter of crowded streets to the voices competing for attention in every meeting or conversation, the modern world is drenched in sound. This flood of noise is not just external. It seeps into our minds, creating an invisible hum of distraction that rarely fades. Yet, beneath this thick curtain of sound lies something profoundly overlooked: the power of silence. Silence is not merely the absence of noise. It is its own presence, a living space where truth can surface, where reflection has room to breathe, and where strength gathers in subtle, quiet ways. In today's culture of relentless expression, where saying more, louder, and faster is equated with influence, silence has been pushed to the background. But what if silence, in its unassuming stillness, is the truest language of strength? What if silence is not emptiness, but the foundation of clarity, influence, and resilience? Pause for a moment. Let the noise around you fade, if only for a few seconds. Feel the weight of the quiet. Notice how in the absence of sound, your heartbeat becomes audible, your breath becomes clearer, and your thoughts rise to the surface. That is the first glimpse of silence's power. It reveals what noise so often hides. Now, before we continue deeper into this exploration, take a moment to reflect. Where are you listening to this audiobook right now? Perhaps you're at home, maybe in a cafe, or commuting. Notice the time of day. Is it morning, when the world is waking and busy? Or evening, when the hum of life slows? Share your moment in the comments below. Let us see how silence touches lives differently depending on where and when it's encountered. And while you're here, remember to subscribe to Audiobook Sanctuary and enable notifications, so this journey into the wisdom of silence can continue with you uninterrupted. In many ways, our culture has turned its back on silence. Think of a typical conversation. A pause, even for 2 seconds, makes people uncomfortable. Someone rushes to fill it with words, fearing awkwardness. Meetings reward the person who speaks the most, not necessarily the one who listens best. Social media algorithms reward noise, content churned out constantly, regardless of depth. Even in education, students are often praised for quick answers rather than thoughtful pauses. Silence in this world is equated with hesitation, uncertainty, even ignorance. And yet, history tells us a different story. Some of the wisest people who have ever lived embraced silence. They understood that it was not a void to be feared, but a space where wisdom incubates. Philosophers, spiritual teachers, and leaders across centuries have recognized silence as both a teacher and a weapon. While noise may entertain or distract, silence penetrates, distills, and clarifies. When silence is lost, so too is depth. Without silence, music would be just an unbroken stream of notes, chaotic and unbearable. Without silence, literature would be nothing but words crashing endlessly, without the pauses that give meaning. Without silence, conversation becomes a competition rather than an exchange. And without silence, life becomes a blur, a continuous rush where reflection, clarity, and wisdom cannot emerge. But how did we come to this point, where silence feels so rare, so uncomfortable? The answer lies in the culture of noise that defines modern living. We glorify activity over stillness, expression over contemplation, visibility over depth. To be silent is often seen as being passive, as lacking relevance. In fact, entire industries profit from keeping us distracted and overstimulated, television, social media, advertising, all thrive on ensuring silence is drowned out. Consider how the design of technology contributes to this. The constant buzzing of notifications is no accident. It is carefully engineered to keep your attention occupied, to fill every possible pocket of silence with stimulation. Even when we walk down the street, earbuds funnel sound into our heads, leaving no space for stillness. We fear boredom so deeply that we flood every moment with activity, as if being alone with silence were unbearable. But this avoidance robs us of a profound resource, the clarity that comes only when noise subsides. Silence is essential, not because it erases the world, but because it gives us the perspective to see it more clearly. When silence disappears, we lose the ability to notice what is happening beneath the surface. Think of water constantly stirred by wind. It is restless, cloudy, impossible to see through. But when the air calms, the water settles, and suddenly its depth is revealed. Silence does the same for the mind. In the presence of silence, truth becomes visible. The tragedy of our noise-driven culture is that silence is often mistaken for weakness. In classrooms, a student who doesn't speak quickly is considered unprepared. In workplaces, the quiet employee is assumed to lack ambition. In relationships, silence is confused with distance. But silence, when chosen intentionally, is none of these things. Silence is strength. Silence is control. Silence is presence. Imagine a leader who does not rush to respond, who allows silence to stretch before speaking. Their words, when they finally come, carry a different weight. Imagine a friend who listens deeply, offering not immediate advice but the gift of quiet presence. Their silence communicates more than words ever could. Imagine an artist who retreats into silence, away from the clamor of the world, and emerges with a creation that resonates across time. In each case, silence is not absence, it is power. What noise culture has done is distort our relationship with silence. We no longer see it as a tool, but as a void, something to escape. Yet the truth is that silence is the foundation of clarity, the soil where wisdom grows. In every tradition, whether in philosophy, religion, or art, silence has been recognized as essential. Monks retreat into silence not to abandon the world, but to see it more clearly. Philosophers paused before speaking because they understood that silence refines thought. Musicians use silence as much as sound because they know that what is unsaid, what is unplayed, often moves us most deeply. To restore the value of silence, we must begin by questioning our fear of it. Why do we feel the need to fill every pause? Why does a quiet room feel uncomfortable? Why do we equate noise with life and silence with stagnation? These questions themselves require silence to answer, for only in quiet can we hear the subtle truths of our own minds. Perhaps the most profound realization is that silence is not external at all. It begins within. Even in the noisiest environment, one can cultivate an inner stillness, a calm presence that is not disturbed by external clamor. But for most of us, that inner silence is buried under layers of distraction. We must first learn to value outer silence, to step away from devices, conversations, and endless input before we can rediscover the silence of the inner self. The first step, then, is to reclaim silence in small ways. Allow pauses in conversation without rushing to fill them. Turn off music or podcasts during a walk and listen to the world around you. Set aside moments in your day where you simply sit without input. These small acts may feel strange at first, like returning to a language you once spoke fluently but forgot. But over time, silence becomes not only comfortable, but essential. The loss of silence in our culture is not irreversible. The very discomfort we feel in its presence is proof of how much we need it. For when silence returns, it nourishes. It restores balance to our overstimulated minds, gives depth to our words, and restores a sense of authenticity in a world of performance. And so, as this journey into the power of silence unfolds, remember, silence is not an absence, but a presence. It is not weakness, but strength. It is not emptiness, but fullness waiting to be discovered. The noise of the world will always be there, but the wisdom of silence is yours to reclaim. If silence has been lost in the culture of noise, then what happens when silence is applied deliberately in communication? What happens when not speaking becomes the strongest message of all? If the culture of noise has taught us to undervalue silence, then nowhere is this more evident than in the way we communicate. We are conditioned to believe that words hold all the power, that the louder we speak, the more persuasive we become. Yet in truth, silence within communication is often the sharpest blade, the most eloquent response, and the most enduring impression. Consider how conversations usually unfold. When two people argue, both often scramble to talk over one another, convinced that victory belongs to the one who delivers the last word. But notice what happens when one participant suddenly grows silent. The energy shifts. The silence unsettles the other, forcing them to reflect, to question their own words, sometimes even to reveal more than they intended. Silence, in this way, is not passivity. It is a mirror, a force that bends the conversation without effort. There are countless ways silence speaks in communication. Sometimes it is agreement, the quiet nod that carries more weight than a dozen sentences. Sometimes it is refusal, the calm, unbroken silence that denies validation to what does not deserve it. Sometimes it is presence, the still listening that makes another feel truly seen. And sometimes silence is strategy, the deliberate pause before a response, which adds gravity to the words that follow. Think of the courtroom. Lawyers, masters of rhetoric, know that silence is part of persuasion. A deliberate pause before presenting a piece of evidence, a quiet hesitation after asking a question. These are not empty spaces, but calculated silences that create tension, anticipation, and power. The same is true in everyday life. A pause before answering a question in an interview signals thoughtfulness. A moment of silence after a heartfelt statement in a relationship signals sincerity. Silence, when intentional, magnifies meaning. The power of silence in communication also lies in its ability to protect. Words once spoken cannot be taken back. They can wound, expose, or entrap us. But silence, wisely chosen, shields us. It prevents escalation and conflict. It keeps secrets safe, and it allows time for emotions to cool before action is taken. There is an old saying, "Don't speak unless you can improve upon silence." This wisdom endures because silence rarely betrays us, but careless words often do. In Eastern traditions, silence has long been honored as a form of communication deeper than speech. In Zen Buddhism, for example, silence is considered the highest teaching, a transmission beyond words. A master may sit in silence before a disciple, and in that quiet presence, more is conveyed than any lecture could deliver. Similarly, in the Christian tradition, moments of silence and prayer are not empty. They are the heart of communion with the divine. Across cultures, silence has always been a language of truth, even when unspoken. In relationships, silence is the space where intimacy grows. Imagine sitting with someone you love in a quiet room. No need to fill the air with words, no urge to explain or perform. The silence itself becomes connection, proof that presence is enough. Contrast this with relationships that fear silence, where constant chatter is used to avoid discomfort. The difference is profound. One is built on trust and depth, the other on insecurity. But silence in communication is not always easy. For many, it feels unnatural, even dangerous. A pause in conversation is quickly filled with nervous laughter, small talk, or rambling. Why? Because silence exposes. It reveals insecurity. It forces people to confront themselves and each other without the cover of words. Yet, if embraced, it becomes the purest form of authenticity. Negotiators understand this well. In tense discussions, a sudden silence can be more powerful than a demand. It compels the other side to speak, to fill the void, often revealing their true position. Leaders understand it too. A pause before making a statement amplifies authority. Parents intuitively know it as well. Sometimes the silent gaze of a parent communicates disappointment or love more strongly than any lecture. Silence, however, must be distinguished from neglect. There is a silence that wounds, the silence that ignores, that withholds affection, that abandons connection. That is not the silence of strength, but of avoidance. The silence we are speaking of here is intentional, chosen, constructive. It does not push people away. It draws them closer to truth. The most profound gift of silence in communication is listening. To truly listen is to be silent, not just with the mouth, but with the mind. Too often, we listen only to prepare our reply, to gather ammunition for our next words. True listening requires silence that absorbs, silence that honors the other person's presence. It is this silence that heals relationships, that bridges divides, that makes people feel understood. There is also silence as protest. History has witnessed countless moments when silence spoke louder than any shouted slogan. Consider the silent marches during the civil rights movement, or the silent vigils held around the world in the face of injustice. These silences were not weakness, they were declarations. They shouted without sound, and the world could not ignore them. The paradox is that silence, though soundless, creates an echo. It lingers in memory longer than words. Recall the last time someone remained silent when you expected a response. That pause still lives with you, doesn't it? Perhaps it stung. Perhaps it comforted. Perhaps it left you pondering. But it did not vanish. Silence leaves its mark. And so, as we begin to reclaim silence, let us remember that communication is not only about words. The spaces between words, the pauses in conversation, the quiet presence in listening, these are as vital as speech. To understand silence is to wield a deeper language, one that penetrates beneath the surface, one that connects more authentically, one that cannot be misquoted or erased. If silence can transform communication, making words stronger and connections deeper, then what happens when we use silence not just in conversation, but in observation? What happens when quiet becomes the lens through which we see the world more clearly? Silence, once reclaimed in communication, begins to open another dimension: observation. For when the tongue grows still, the eyes and ears awaken. When noise fades, perception sharpens. In silence, the world reveals details that chatter conceals, and life discloses truths that words often obscure. Think for a moment about sitting in a busy cafe. With headphones on, music blaring, and phone in hand, the cafe is nothing but background. But if you remove the noise, if you set aside the distractions and allow silence to frame the moment, Suddenly, the details emerge. You notice the rhythm of footsteps against the wooden floor. You see the way sunlight pools in corners, catching motes of dust as they drift like tiny constellations. You hear the nervous tapping of a pen against a notebook, the sigh of someone lost in thought, the clinking of a cup returned gently to its saucer. These fragments, invisible amid noise, become vivid in silence. The ordinary grows extraordinary, because silence restores your capacity to observe. Observation born of silence is not merely sensory, it is also psychological and spiritual. In silence, we do not just see the world, we see people as they are. Words can disguise, masks can distract. But in silence, subtleties emerge. The way someone avoids eye contact when they are uncertain, the pause before they answer when they are unsure, the tension in their shoulders that betrays what their smile tries to hide. Silence uncovers the layers beneath performance. Philosophers have long insisted that true knowledge begins with observation. Aristotle taught that wonder is the beginning of wisdom, and wonder itself cannot arise in noise. It requires stillness, the quiet pause that notices what others overlook. When we are loud, hasty, and distracted, we miss the nuances of life. But when silence steadies us, observation becomes revelation. Think of a skilled detective. Their craft is not in speaking, but in watching, waiting, allowing silence to uncover clues. They know that people reveal more in silence than in speech. A nervous glance, an unsteady breath, an unintended gesture. All of these are louder than words, but only if the observer has cultivated silence within themselves. In many ways, life is no different. The more we can quiet our own noise, the mental chatter, the rush to speak, the more clearly we perceive the truth unfolding before us. But observation is not only outward, it is also inward. In silence, we observe ourselves. We notice thoughts we usually ignore. We hear the subtle voice of intuition, so often drowned out by external distraction. We recognize patterns in our behavior, emotions rising and falling, desires tugging at us. This self-observation, born in silence, is perhaps the most transformative of all. For how can we hope to understand others or the world if we cannot see ourselves clearly? Modern life rarely encourages this kind of observation. Algorithms, advertisements, and conversations constantly demand attention, leaving no space for reflective silence. Yet, it is in silence that the roots of wisdom grow. Without it, we remain surface dwellers, skimming the noise of existence, but never diving into its depth. With it, we learn to see what is hidden, both in the world and within. There is also a discipline to observation through silence. It requires patience, the willingness to let events unfold without rushing to interpret or control them. It requires humility, the acknowledgement that the world speaks on its own terms, not ours. And it requires courage, because what silence reveals is not always comfortable. To sit quietly and observe may expose truths we would rather avoid, about others, about society, about ourselves. Yet in facing them, we grow. One of the profound lessons of silence in observation is that truth does not shout. Reality does not need noise to prove itself. The rising sun does not announce itself with fanfare. A flower does not demand applause to bloom. A person's true nature does not always appear in their words, but in their actions when silence surrounds them. If we wish to live wisely, we must learn to be quiet enough to see what does not clamor for attention. Consider how silence changes even the most ordinary moments. Watch a child play in silence, and you see imagination unfold. Stories created, worlds invented, all without explanation. Watch an elder sit quietly on a porch, and you see years of memory resting in their stillness. Watch the turning of seasons in silence, and you sense the rhythm of life itself. In each case, silence allows us to perceive what noise would have drowned out. Even in conflict, observation through silence is transformative. When arguments rise, silence gives you perspective. Instead of reacting to every word, you notice tone, body language, the emotions underneath. Instead of being pulled into chaos, you step outside and see the storm for what it is. That shift changes everything. It is the difference between being trapped inside a whirlwind and standing on a hill watching it move. Silence grants that vantage point. In spiritual traditions, silence and observation are inseparable. In meditation, practitioners are taught to watch thoughts come and go like clouds across the sky. They do not chase them, do not fight them, do not amplify them. They observe in silence, and in doing so, they discover that thoughts are not the self. The same principle applies in life. When we watch quietly, we discover that appearances are not reality, that surfaces are not essence. Silence also teaches us to observe the spaces between events, the pauses between words, the gaps between breaths. These interludes, often ignored, are as real as the events themselves. Just as music is shaped by rests as much as notes, life is shaped by the pauses as much as actions. To observe in silence is to honor the whole, not just the noise. The great irony is that we often crave clarity yet run from silence, the very condition that produces it. We want to understand others, but we drown them in our own words. We want to know ourselves, but we flee into distractions. We want truth, but we demand it shout over the noise we refuse to release. Only when we surrender to silence do we realize that truth whispers, and only those who are quiet enough can hear it. As you think of your own life, ask yourself, when was the last time you allowed silence to guide your observation? When was the last time you paused before reacting, watched before speaking, or listened without planning your reply? If silence has the power to open your eyes and ears, what truths might you discover if you embraced it more fully? Silence is not absence, it is attention. It does not mute the world, it magnifies it. Through silence, we see clearly, listen deeply, and perceive fully. And once you have tasted this clarity, the world never looks the same again. If silence sharpens our ability to observe the outer world and ourselves, then imagine the depth it brings when turned entirely inward. Beyond observing, silence has the power to heal, to restore, to anchor us in inner quietude. And it is to that sanctuary of inner silence that we now turn. The journey of silence now turns inward. If silence in communication strengthens connection, and silence in observation deepens perception, then silence within the self becomes something even greater: healing. For beneath the layers of noise and distraction, every human carries an inner sanctuary, a quiet space untouched by chaos. It is here, in the stillness of inner silence, that the spirit finds restoration. Consider the pace of modern living. Our days are stacked with tasks, expectations, and endless streams of information. The mind becomes like a crowded marketplace, thoughts rushing in all directions, emotions colliding, worries shouting for attention. In such a state, no wonder exhaustion becomes common. No wonder peace feels distant. Yet silence offers a way back. When we step away from the constant input, when we turn down the inner volume, we discover a stillness that does not depend on the outside world. That stillness is not weakness, but strength. It is the foundation of resilience. Meditation is one of the clearest expressions of this inner silence. Though many imagine meditation as complicated or mystical, at its core it is simple. Sitting still, breathing, and allowing the noise of the mind to settle. Thoughts still come, but instead of chasing them or fighting them, you let them pass, like leaves floating down a river. Slowly, the chatter softens, and beneath it, silence emerges. This silence is not empty. It is alive. It carries peace, clarity, and a sense of being grounded in something larger than yourself. Even a few minutes of meditation each day can change the texture of life. Science confirms what spiritual traditions have always known. Silence calms the nervous system, lowers stress, improves focus, and heals the mind. But beyond science, there is something profoundly human about reclaiming inner silence. It reminds us that we are not merely participants in the noise of the world. We are also custodians of our own stillness. Yet inner silence is not found only in meditation. It can be discovered in the rhythm of breath, in the quiet of early morning before the world awakens, in the simple act of sitting by a window and watching rain fall. It is found in prayer, in mindful walking, in pausing before a meal to give thanks. It is in these everyday silences that the soul catches its breath. There is also a dimension of healing in silence that words cannot reach. When grief strikes, people often rush to speak, to comfort, to explain, to fill the unbearable quiet. But those who have suffered know that words rarely touch the deepest wounds. What comforts most is presence, silent companionship, the shared acknowledgement of pain without needing to wrap it in language. In silence, grief is honored. In silence, love speaks without speaking. Silence also brings perspective. When you quiet the inner noise, problems that once felt overwhelming begin to shrink. Anger cools, fear loosens, desires become clearer. It is as if silence reorders the clutter of the mind, placing what truly matters in the foreground and letting the rest fall away. This is why many traditions view silence as cleansing. It washes the spirit of accumulated dust, but inner silence is not always easy to reach. The first time you sit in stillness, the noise of the mind often grows louder. Worries, memories, to-do lists, all rise up as if to challenge your effort. Many give up here, thinking silence is impossible. Yet this is natural. Like muddy water, the mind must stir before it can settle. If you persist, if you allow the turbulence to pass, silence eventually surfaces. And when it does, it feels like coming home. Throughout history, those who sought wisdom turned to silence. Monks withdrew to deserts and mountaintops, not to escape life, but to encounter it more deeply. Mystics entered silent retreats to hear the voice of the divine. Writers, thinkers, and artists carved out silent hours to let creativity emerge. Each discovered that silence is not a luxury, but a necessity. Without it, the soul starves. With it, the soul flourishes. Inner silence is also a form of resistance. In a world that demands constant reaction, choosing to be still is revolutionary. It is saying, I will not be defined by the rush, the noise, the chaos. I will ground myself in quiet, and from that quiet, I will live more wisely. This resistance is not against others, but against the forces that scatter us, that steal our attention, that keep us from depth. Silence restores sovereignty over the self. Perhaps the most beautiful gift of inner silence is presence. When you cultivate stillness within, you bring that peace into every moment. Conversations become less frantic. Decisions become less reactive. Relationships become less strained. People around you feel the calm you carry, even if you never speak of it. In this way, silence within does not remain within. It radiates outward, shaping the world around you. And so, healing through silence is not withdrawal, but renewal. It is not about escaping life, but entering it more fully. When you find the quiet place inside yourself, you discover a reservoir of strength, peace, and clarity that cannot be shaken by noise. It becomes your anchor in storms, your compass in confusion, your refuge in weariness. If silence within can heal, then imagine the power of silence when used not just personally, but publicly. Imagine leaders, teachers, and visionaries who wield silence as influence, not just as refuge. Imagine history itself being shaped by those who understood that silence can be more commanding than speech. To this, we now turn: the influence of silence in leadership and the power it holds over others. Throughout history, leadership has often been associated with strong voices, commanding speeches, and stirring declarations. We recall generals rallying armies with words, politicians shaping nations with oratory, and activists inspiring movements through fiery speeches. Yet there is another kind of leadership, quieter but no less powerful, built not on noise but on silence. This is the leadership of presence, restraint, and stillness. The leadership that influences not by dominating conversations, but by commanding respect through calm silence. Think of the greatest leaders the world has known. Not all of them spoke constantly. Some understood that silence itself could be strategy. Abraham Lincoln, for example, was famous for listening in long stretches of quiet during meetings. He would allow others to speak, absorbing every perspective, and then deliver a single statement, measured, thoughtful, transformative. His silence was not passivity, but preparation, and when his words finally came, they carried the weight of wisdom. Mahatma Gandhi is another timeless example. He embodied silence as a moral force. Gandhi often practiced intentional days of silence, refraining from speech altogether. Far from making him weak or irrelevant, this discipline gave his words greater gravity when he did speak. His silence reflected inner mastery, a refusal to be consumed by noise or anger. In moments of tension, his quiet presence radiated more influence than any shouting could. True leaders understand what many overlook. Noise can intimidate, but silence commands. When a leader chooses silence, people lean in. They wonder what is being thought, what wisdom is forming, what strength lies beneath the stillness. Silence creates space for others to speak, empowering their voices, while at the same time deepening the authority of the one who listens. Silence in leadership also cultivates trust. A leader who does not rush to respond, who allows silence before answering, communicates patience and thoughtfulness. Their decisions are not impulsive but deliberate. Silence signals that they are not ruled by ego or the need to dominate. They are guided by discernment. In contrast, leaders who fill every silence with words often reveal insecurity, as if afraid of being overshadowed. The strongest leaders do not fear silence. They wield it. Even in military history, silence has played a role in leadership. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, taught that a general must know when to remain still, to wait in silence, allowing the enemy to reveal their weakness. Restraint, patience, and quiet observation were as vital as direct commands. In this way, silence becomes not absence of action, but a form of action itself, a tactical decision that alters outcomes. Leaders in spiritual traditions have also modeled silence as influence. The Buddha, for instance, is often remembered less for what he said than for the quiet presence he embodied. His silence was a teaching in itself. Followers recognized that peace and wisdom radiated not only through his words, but through the stillness he carried. Jesus, too, practiced the power of silence, moments when he refused to answer his accusers, letting silence speak more forcefully than defense. These examples show that silence is not weakness, but the language of those rooted in unshakable strength. In modern contexts, we see this dynamic in boardrooms, classrooms, and even personal relationships. The leader who listens silently in a meeting gains insight others miss. The teacher who allows silence in the classroom gives students space to think deeply. The parent who responds to a child's defiance with calm silence rather than reactive words communicates stability. In each case, silence is not passive but active, shaping the atmosphere, guiding behavior, influencing outcomes. Of course, silence in leadership is not the same as disengagement. A silent leader who withdraws completely leaves a void that breeds confusion. The silence that empowers is intentional and purposeful. It is silence that listens, silence that absorbs, silence that prepares. It is the kind of silence that, when broken, gives birth to words that matter. There is also an ethical dimension to silence in leadership. To remain silent in the face of injustice can be complicity. Leaders must know when silence empowers and when it betrays. The strength of silence lies not in avoiding responsibility, but in magnifying the right response. When paired with wisdom, silence guides leaders to speak at the right time, with the right words, carrying the right weight. The rhythm of leadership is, in many ways, like music. Too many notes, played without pause, become noise. But silence, the rests, the pauses, gives shape and power to the melody. Similarly, leadership without silence becomes mere chatter, but with silence, it becomes symphony. Consider your own experience with leaders in your life. Who has influenced you most? Was it the one who never stopped talking, or the one whose quiet presence gave you confidence? Was it the one who filled every moment with instructions, or the one who allowed silence, creating space for you to step forward? The leaders we remember are often those who knew how to balance words with silence, action with restraint. Silence in leadership is influence without volume. It is authority without arrogance. It is presence without performance. And perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that true strength does not always need to announce itself. The oak tree does not shout, yet it shelters. The mountain does not speak, yet it inspires awe. Likewise, the leader rooted in silence shapes others not by noise, but by the quiet force of example. If silence can transform leadership, elevating it from mere authority to true influence, then it must also hold a deeper dimension still. Beyond communication, beyond observation, beyond even leadership, silence has always been revered as sacred. It has been the bridge between human and divine, the meeting place of spirit and eternity. Let us now step into that dimension, the spiritual power of silence. Beyond its influence in leadership, silence carries a dimension that reaches deeper than strategy or psychology. It is a dimension both mysterious and timeless, the spiritual power of silence. For centuries, seekers of wisdom, saints, mystics, and philosophers have turned to silence not simply as a tool, but as a doorway. They discovered that silence is more than a practice of restraint. It is a bridge to the divine, a sacred space where the soul communes with something greater than itself. In every spiritual tradition, silence has been revered as a path to transcendence. In Christianity, monks withdrew into monasteries where silence became prayer in itself. In Judaism, the mystics of Kabbalah spoke of the Ein Sof, the boundless, experienced most profoundly in silent contemplation. In Islam, the Sufis used silence as a way to still the ego and open the heart to God. In Buddhism, silence is meditation, a practice of dissolving illusion to perceive truth. In Hinduism, silence, mauna, is seen as the natural expression of the awakened soul, for truth is beyond words. Across continents and centuries, silence has always been honored as a sacred teacher. Why is silence so spiritual? Because words, as powerful as they are limited. They can describe, suggest, and symbolize, but they cannot contain the infinite. Silence, on the other hand, does not attempt to reduce the eternal to syllables. It opens space for direct experience. When the chatter of the mind ceases, the soul awakens to realities that words cannot hold. This is why mystics often say that the deepest truths are unspeakable, and why silence becomes the highest form of expression. Silence also purifies. In stillness, the distractions of ego fade. Pride, anger, envy, fear, all lose their grip when met with deep silence. The restless energy of desire calms, and the soul begins to taste peace. Many describe this as an inner cleansing, as if silence were a fire that burns away illusions, leaving only what is real. Those who return from deep silence often radiate a serenity that cannot be faked. It is the signature of someone who has touched the eternal. There is also a listening in silence that is unlike any other. In prayer, people often speak, asking, pleading, giving thanks. But prayer in silence is different. It is not speaking to the divine, but listening for it. It is creating a stillness where the whisper of the eternal can be heard. Some describe it as the still small voice that Elijah heard, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the quiet. Others call it intuition, inner guidance, or the voice of the higher self. Regardless of the name, silence makes it audible. The power of silence is also found in ritual. Moments of collective silence, whether in places of worship or in public gatherings, carry an almost tangible weight. Think of the hush before a sacred ceremony, the silence before a candle is lit, the collective quiet of a community in mourning. These silences are not empty. They are charged with presence. They remind us that silence is not nothingness. It is fullness, brimming with meaning. Even outside religious traditions, silence has a spiritual quality. To sit in a forest and hear only the rustle of leaves, to watch the night sky in quiet awe, to walk along the shore with only the rhythm of waves. These experiences awaken something primal. In silence, we sense that we are part of a greater whole. We feel the pulse of life not as a theory, but as a presence. We realize that silence is not just within us, but around us, woven into the fabric of creation. Perhaps this is why silence has always been linked to wisdom. The wisest figures in history often said little. Socrates claimed to know nothing, yet his silence often provoked deeper reflection than his questions. Lao Tzu, author of the Tao Te Ching, spoke of the Tao as something that cannot be expressed in words. His brief verses are pregnant with silence, inviting the reader to contemplate what lies between the lines. True wisdom does not rush to explain. It rests in silence, allowing truth to reveal itself. But silence as a spiritual practice is not easy. To embrace it, one must confront the restless mind, the fears and doubts that rise when the usual distractions fall away. This confrontation is why so many avoid silence. They fear what they will find in the quiet. Yet it is precisely in that quiet that healing and transformation occur. As one mystic put it, silence is God's first language. Everything else is a poor translation. The spiritual power of silence also teaches humility. In the presence of silence, we realize how small our words are compared to the vastness of existence. We are reminded that we do not control everything, that there are mysteries beyond explanation. And in that humility, we find peace. Silence humbles us, but it also elevates us, connecting us to something eternal. In everyday life, we can touch this spiritual silence in small ways. A quiet morning before the city wakes, a pause before answering a difficult question, a moment of stillness after reading something profound. Each is an opportunity to remember the sacred hidden within silence. These are not escapes from life, but doorways into its depth. Silence, in its spiritual dimension, is not withdrawal from the world, but communion with it. It dissolves the illusion of separation, uniting us with ourselves, with others, and with the divine. It is not about being alone, but about remembering that we are never truly alone. In silence, the boundaries blur, and the eternal whispers. If silence can be a sacred bridge, opening us to the divine and awakening wisdom, then what other gifts might it hold? Beyond spirituality, silence also feeds creativity. It unlocks the imagination, giving birth to ideas that noise suffocates. And it is there, in the quiet source of inspiration, that we next turn. Silence has given us tools to communicate with depth, to observe with clarity, to lead with influence, and to touch the divine. But there is another gift it holds, one that touches every artist, thinker, and innovator across time: creativity. For silence is not just a sanctuary of rest, it is the womb of creation. It is in stillness that ideas gestate, where imagination stretches its wings, and where the unseen becomes visible. Think of the painter before the blank canvas. Before the first stroke of color is laid down, there is silence. Think of the composer sitting at a piano, hands hovering just above the keys, listening inwardly before sound emerges. Think of the writer staring at the empty page, the quiet in the room mirroring the quiet inside as words take shape. In all these moments, silence is not absence but possibility, the fertile ground from which creation arises. Noise, by contrast, often strangles creativity. When the mind is crowded with chatter, when distractions pull us in every direction, inspiration has no space to breathe. Ideas, like delicate seedlings, require stillness to grow. They cannot sprout in soil constantly disturbed. Silence is the still soil. It is the patient ground in which imagination roots itself, nourished by calm and protected from the storm of noise. History is filled with examples of how silence has birthed creativity. Beethoven, when his deafness silenced the outer world, turned inward and composed some of his greatest works. His silence became music that transcended his era. Nikola Tesla often spent long hours alone in quiet contemplation, envisioning entire inventions in his mind before building them. Emily Dickinson lived much of her life in solitude and silence. But from that silence came poetry that continues to echo through generations. Their genius was not born in chaos, but in stillness. Silence nurtures creativity because it clears the mind. When you step into silence, the noise of expectation fades. The voices of critics, the weight of comparison, the pressure of deadlines, all quiet down. What remains is the raw spark of curiosity, the pure flow of imagination. In silence, you remember why you create, not for approval, not for applause, but because the act of creating itself is life-giving. It is no coincidence that many great thinkers deliberately sought silence. Einstein often spoke of how long walks in silence were essential to his breakthroughs. He understood that the mind, when freed from constant noise, begins to make connections invisible before. Steve Jobs, too, was known for his silent walks, where many of his most important ideas formed. These examples remind us that silence is not laziness or emptiness. It is incubation. There is also a rhythm to creativity that mirrors silence. Just as music requires rests to give meaning to notes, so does the creative process require pauses. Ideas cannot flow endlessly without moments of quiet. Silence gives shape to creativity the way breath gives shape to speech. Without it, everything collapses into noise. With it, beauty emerges. But silence in creativity is not only about the moment of inspiration, it is also about listening. Artists often describe a sense of receiving rather than inventing ideas. They say the song came to them, the story arrived, the painting revealed itself. This language suggests that creativity is less about forcing and more about listening. And what is listening, if not silence? To be creative is to cultivate silence, to tune into the whispers of something beyond the conscious mind, something deeper, something universal. Silence also helps us overcome fear in creation. Many people never begin their creative journeys because they fear judgment. They imagine the noise of criticism before a single word is written, before a single note is played. But in silence, these fears lose their volume. The quiet offers courage, reminding us that creation is first and foremost a dialogue with oneself, not with the crowd. In silence, the artist remembers that the first audience is always the soul. Perhaps the most profound aspect of silence in creativity is how it reveals that we are not separate from creation itself. When you enter deep silence and ideas arise, it feels less like you invented something and more like you discovered it. It is as if silence itself is the source, and you are simply the channel. This is why so many artists describe their best work as flowing through them rather than from them. Silence is the medium through which inspiration travels. You may have noticed this in your own life. Perhaps in a quiet shower, a solution to a problem suddenly surfaced. Perhaps in the silence before sleep, an idea emerged that had eluded you all day. Perhaps on a walk without headphones, clarity appeared uninvited. These moments are not accidents. They are the fruit of silence. They are reminders that creativity does not come from trying harder, but from listening deeper. And so, to nurture creativity, one must cultivate silence. Turn off the noise. Step away from distractions. Sit in stillness long enough for the whispers of imagination to be heard. Creativity does not shout. It waits. And silence is the doorway through which it enters. If silence can inspire art, invention, and poetry, then what about history itself? What about those figures who not only created in silence, but shaped entire societies through it? Some of the greatest leaders, thinkers, and heroes did not conquer with noise, but with quiet strength. Let us now look at those whose silent power changed the course of history. When we look back through history, we often recall the voices that rang loudly across generations, the speeches that stirred crowds, the proclamations that shifted nations. Yet woven through the timeline of humanity is another thread, quieter but no less powerful. The individuals who shaped history not by volume, but by silence. Their strength was not in the noise they made, but in the quiet they embodied. Their legacies remind us that silence, when chosen with purpose, can leave an impact louder than words. Consider George Washington at the end of the Revolutionary War. He could have seized power, could have declared himself king of a new nation. Instead, he chose silence, stepping away, surrendering authority, returning to his farm. His refusal to fill the space with ambition, his deliberate quiet, spoke volumes to a young country. It declared that leadership was service, not domination. That silence, more than any speech, helped shape the democratic ideals of the United States, or think of Rosa Parks. Her act of defiance was not accompanied by shouting. She did not raise her voice in protest when told to give up her seat. She simply sat in silence, rooted in dignity. That quiet presence shook the foundations of segregation and ignited a movement. Her silence was not submission, it was defiance, carved in stillness. It revealed that sometimes the absence of words carries the strongest message. Another striking example is Nelson Mandela. During his 27 years in prison, silence was forced upon him. Yet he transformed that silence into strength. By refusing to allow bitterness or despair to consume him, Mandela's quiet endurance became a symbol for an entire people. When he emerged, his silence had ripened into wisdom. His calm presence gave him moral authority that no volume could ever achieve. Even in the realm of art and science, silence shaped history. Isaac Newton worked in relative quiet, often isolating himself for years. Out of that silence emerged discoveries that altered humanity's understanding of the universe. Vincent van Gogh lived largely in silence, rarely recognized during his life. Yet the stillness in which he painted produced works that speak to millions long after his death. Their contributions remind us that history is not only written by the loud, but also by the silent. Silence in history is also collective. Moments of shared quiet have marked turning points in human memory. Think of the minutes of silence observed after tragedies, the unspoken unity of nations grieving together. These silences are more powerful than any speech because they are not fragmented by words. They gather humanity into a single presence, reminding us of our shared fragility and strength. There are times when silence has been used as protest. The women of Argentina's Plaza de Mayo, who gathered in silent marches to demand the return of their missing children, carried more force through their quiet presence than through slogans. The Quakers, known for their silent meetings, used silence as both worship and resistance, declaring with their stillness that truth does not need to be shouted. Silence, wielded collectively, has the power to confront injustice with dignity and unyielding strength. But we must be honest. Not all silence in history has been noble. There were also times when silence meant complicity, when those who should have spoken out against evil remained quiet. That kind of silence is not strength, but surrender. What distinguishes the silence of strength from the silence of weakness is intention. Rosa Parks' silence was chosen. Mandela's silence was endured and transformed. Washington's silence was principled. True silence in history is deliberate. It carries purpose, and its message echoes long after. One might ask, how could something as intangible as silence shape the course of nations? The answer is that silence directs attention. It disrupts the expected flow. When everyone anticipates words and none are given, the absence itself becomes a statement. Silence compels reflection. It unsettles. It shifts power. This is why so many historical figures, whether consciously or intuitively, used silence as a tool of influence. What unites these figures is not their quietness alone, but the authority their silence carried. They were not silent because they had nothing to say. They were silent because their presence was already enough. Their silence framed their actions, amplified their choices, and gave their lives a resonance that words could not match. And so, when we remember the great shapers of history, let us not forget those who wielded silence. Their legacies remind us that sometimes the loudest revolutions begin with quiet acts. Sometimes the strongest leaders speak most powerfully when they say nothing at all. And sometimes, silence itself becomes history's most enduring voice. If silence can shape nations and transform history, it can also transform something closer to home, our relationships. For just as silence influences crowds and leaders, it also carries power in the most intimate spaces, between friends, lovers, families. Let us now turn to the quiet language of silence in relationships, where presence without words often speaks the loudest. Silence has the power to sway history and reshape nations, but its influence also reaches into the most intimate corners of our lives, our relationships. For it is in the quiet spaces between words that trust is tested, bonds are strengthened, and presence becomes its own kind of language. In relationships, whether romantic, familial, or friendships, silence often says more than speech ever could. Think of two people who love each other deeply. They sit together, no words spoken, yet the room feels full. There is no pressure to fill the air, no need to impress, explain, or entertain. Their silence is not awkward. It is ease, proof that their connection runs deeper than conversation. This is the silence of intimacy, where being together is enough. The strongest relationships often carry this quality, that the absence of words does not weaken the bond, but strengthens it. On the other hand, silence can also reveal fracture. When distance grows, silence shifts from comfort to discomfort. The same absence of words that once signaled closeness now signals avoidance. This is why silence in relationships is so powerful. It reveals the truth beneath the surface. We can fake words, but we cannot fake silence. Our presence or our withdrawal is felt even without speech. But when chosen with care, silence becomes a gift in relationships. To listen without interruption is one form of loving silence. When someone pours out their heart, they do not always need advice. Often they need space to be heard. A silence that listens attentively can heal more than 1,000 reassurances. The pause that lets someone cry, the quiet that does not rush them, the stillness that honors their feelings. This is silence as compassion. Silence is also protection. Words spoken in anger can wound in ways that linger long after tempers cool. In moments of conflict, silence can be a shield. Choosing not to speak until emotions settle prevents harm. This is not the silence of avoidance, but of wisdom. The silence that says, "I will not let temporary fire burn something permanent." Many relationships are saved not by brilliant arguments, but by chosen silences. There is also the silence of presence. To sit with a grieving friend, saying nothing, simply being there. That silence becomes love made tangible. No words can erase loss, but silence can hold it with dignity. Parents often know this instinctively. When a child is hurt, the quiet embrace speaks louder than explanations. Lovers know it too. Sometimes a hand held in silence says more than any declaration. Yet we must distinguish between silence that nurtures and silence that harms. The silent treatment, used as punishment or manipulation, corrodes relationships. It weaponizes absence, turning what should be healing into hostility. True silence in relationships is not about control, but about connection. It seeks to preserve, not punish. Cultivating silence in relationships also means making space for mystery. No matter how close two people are, there are parts of each other they will never fully know. Silence honors this. It acknowledges that love does not mean total explanation. It respects the unspoken depths within each person. When couples or friends can sit together and let mystery breathe, they discover a deeper kind of respect. In a world addicted to constant communication, texting, calling, messaging, choosing silence can feel radical. But sometimes, the most loving thing is to give space, to not demand immediate replies, to allow each other the quiet needed to rest, think, and simply be. Relationships suffocate under constant noise. They flourish when balanced with silence. Silence also invites reflection. After an argument, a period of quiet allows both sides to consider what truly matters. After a moment of joy, silence allows the feeling to deepen, to be savored rather than rushed past. Without silence, relationships risk becoming endless exchanges of words without meaning. With silence, every word gains weight. Think of how music mirrors relationships. Notes are important, but so are the rests. A song without pauses is noise, just as a relationship without silence is exhaustion. Silence gives shape, rhythm, and depth. It allows love to breathe. In the end, silence in relationships is not about absence, but about presence. It is not about withholding, but about honoring. It says, "I trust you enough not to fill every space. I respect you enough to listen without interruption. I love you enough to simply be with you, without needing more." When we embrace silence in relationships, we learn to see beyond words. We begin to understand that love, trust, and connection often live in what is unsaid. And in those quiet spaces, bonds grow stronger, deeper, more enduring. If silence has this power in the intimate world of relationships, what does it teach us about life itself? Could it be that silence is not emptiness at all, but wisdom, the very language of intelligence and truth? To that final reflection, we now turn. We have followed silence through culture, communication, observation, inner healing, leadership, spirituality, creativity, history, and relationships. Each path has revealed something different, yet all lead to the same realization. Silence is not weakness, not absence, not emptiness. Silence is wisdom. It is the hidden intelligence that shapes perception, deepens understanding, and transforms life itself. In a noisy world, wisdom is often mistaken for speed. We equate knowledge with rapid answers, progress with constant motion, relevance with perpetual speech. But wisdom is not noise. It is not found in the clamor of voices competing to be heard. Wisdom is born in quiet. It is nurtured in stillness. It matures in the spaces where words fall short. Silence is not a lack of intelligence. It is its highest expression. Think of the greatest thinkers and sages. They did not rush to speak. They paused. They considered. They allowed silence to refine their thoughts. Their words carried weight not because they were many, but because they were distilled through quiet reflection. In the silence before speech, truth was allowed to ripen. This is why a single phrase from a wise person can outweigh entire volumes of noise. Silence is wisdom because it teaches patience. It reminds us that not every question needs an immediate answer. Not every conflict requires instant reaction. Not every decision must be made in haste. Wisdom waits. It understands that truth unfolds in time, that clarity emerges when the dust settles. The impatient demand answers now. The wise allow silence to do its work. Silence is wisdom because it teaches humility. When you sit in silence, you realize how vast life is, how small your own voice is compared to the expanse of existence. This humility is not defeat, it is freedom. It frees us from the illusion of control, from the arrogance of thinking we must fill every space with our opinions. Silence humbles, but in humbling, it also opens us to greater truths. Silence is wisdom because it sharpens perception. It tunes us to subtleties, teaches us to listen deeply, to notice what others miss. The wise are not those who speak most, but those who perceive most. Their silence is not ignorance, but insight, the ability to see beyond the surface. Silence is wisdom because it guards truth. Words can be twisted, misquoted, misunderstood. Silence cannot. It preserves integrity, refusing to give itself away cheaply. Many have regretted words spoken in haste, but few have regretted remaining silent when speech would have been reckless. Silence protects wisdom from being diluted. Most of all, silence is wisdom because it connects us to what is eternal. Noise belongs to the surface of life. Trends, debates, arguments, fleeting distractions. Silence belongs to the depths. It anchors us in what does not change, what endures beyond time. In silence, we touch the dimension of existence that cannot be shaken by the rise and fall of noise. This is why so many traditions speak of silence as the highest teacher. It teaches without lecturing. It reveals without demanding. It speaks without words. To those who embrace it, silence becomes a lifelong companion, a constant reminder that truth is not always shouted but often whispered, waiting to be heard by those willing to listen. And so, to see silence as wisdom is to change how we live. It means no longer fearing quiet, no longer running from stillness. It means valuing pauses as much as progress, listening as much as speaking, presence as much as performance. It means remembering that wisdom is not about adding more noise to the world, but about discerning when to remain quiet, when to let silence speak for itself. If the culture of noise tells us that silence is empty, wisdom tells us it is full of clarity, patience, humility, truth, full of presence, strength, and influence. Silence is not a gap to be filled. It is a well to be drawn from. So the question is no longer, what is silence? The question is, what wisdom are we missing when we ignore it? What truths might surface if we allowed silence to speak more often in our lives? Perhaps the final lesson is this: silence does not compete with noise. It outlasts it. Words echo for a time, then fade. Noise rises and falls, but silence remains, steady, patient, eternal. And in its quiet endurance, silence reveals what wisdom truly is: the strength to remain unshaken, the clarity to see truth, the humility to accept mystery. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is intelligence. Silence is wisdom. Silence has accompanied us through this entire journey, appearing in many forms, as strength in communication, as clarity in observation, as healing in the soul, as influence in leadership, as reverence in spirituality, as inspiration in creativity, as resilience in history, as intimacy in relationships, and finally, as wisdom itself. Each dimension has shown us that silence is not the absence of life, but the fullness of it. The truth is that silence is always present, though we often overlook it. Between every word you speak, there is silence. Between every note of music, silence gives shape. Between every heartbeat, silence rests. It is woven into the fabric of existence. To embrace silence is not to retreat from life, but to step more fully into its rhythm. We live in an age where silence is undervalued, where noise is equated with significance. But imagine, for a moment, a life lived differently. Imagine conversations where pauses are honored, where listening is as important as speaking. Imagine relationships where presence matters more than performance. Imagine leadership that wields silence as wisely as words. Imagine a society that does not drown in noise but finds strength in stillness. Such a world would not be weaker, but stronger. It would not be emptier, but richer. Silence also gives us ourselves. In its quiet embrace, we rediscover who we are beneath the roles, distractions, and expectations. We meet our truest self in silence, the part of us that is calm, resilient, and wise. This is why silence heals. It does not change the outer world, but it transforms our inner one. And from that inner transformation, everything else shifts. If you take one lesson from this journey, let it be this: do not fear silence. Do not treat it as a void to be filled, but as a presence to be welcomed. Create moments of silence in your life. Step away from the noise, if only for a few minutes each day. Allow yourself to sit, breathe, and listen. You will find that silence is not empty. It is overflowing with meaning. And so, let us end where we began, with the invitation to listen. Listen not only to the words of this audiobook, but to the silence surrounding them. Listen to the quiet between your breaths, the stillness within your own heart. For in that silence lies wisdom, peace, and the strength to live with clarity in a noisy world. Silence is not a gap in life. It is the ground of life itself. It is not weakness, but strength. Not emptiness, but wisdom. Not retreat, but presence. Embrace it, and you will find that silence has been speaking to you all along. So tonight, or tomorrow, or in whatever moment you feel overwhelmed, try this. Turn off the noise, close your eyes, and let silence embrace you. You may be surprised to find that what you thought was nothing is, in fact, everything. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the presence of wisdom. And perhaps, just perhaps, silence has been waiting for you all along.